Adolf Hitler's response to the imminent fall of Berlin, primarily articulated in his political testament signed on April 29th, was one of absolute, entrenched delusion, coupled with a dramatic accusation of treason against his own senior staff. He refused, even in the face of overwhelming military evidence, to acknowledge the reality of the defeat. Instead, he chose to scapegoat, blaming the war's failure entirely on the alleged incompetence and treason of the German army's general staff and his closest subordinates, particularly Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring and Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. His final political act was not one of strategic command, but of internal purging, expelling Göring and Himmler from the Nazi Party, stripping them of all offices, naming Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor, Reichspräsident, and retaining Joseph Goebbels as his chancellor. Hitler's last coherent order to the field was a desperate, rhetorical call to continue fighting to the last man, showing no willingness to negotiate or concede defeat to the advancing Soviet forces. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, who was suddenly and unexpectedly designated by Hitler as his successor, learned of his new appointment after Hitler's suicide, operating from his headquarters in Flensburg, far from the chaos of Berlin. Donitz's immediate reaction and overarching strategy were purely pragmatic and coldly rational, focused entirely on damage control and mitigating the human disaster. His primary order to the fragmented Wehrmacht was twofold: continue fighting the Soviet forces fiercely in the east to slow their advance, while simultaneously trying to broker a rapid tactical partial surrender to the Western Allies, British Americans, in the West. The ultimate goal, as he repeatedly communicated, was explicitly humanitarian: to save and evacuate as many German soldiers and, critically, millions of German civilians as possible from the Soviet-occupied East to the relative safety of the West, thereby preventing their capture and anticipated brutality. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the OKW, Armed Forces High Command, and long known as Hitler's most loyal and slavishly obedient military lackey, remained within the shrinking Berlin pocket almost until the final moment. Keitel's reaction was characterized by blind, panicked obedience to Hitler's final, utterly delusional commands, even as the Führer prepared for his own suicide. On April 29th, Keitel issued a series of frantic, impossible orders, attempting to direct the non-existent relief efforts of General Walter Wenck's 12th Army toward the center of Berlin. His final recorded statements were filled with bombastic rhetorical demands for unyielding loyalty and fanatical sacrifice, desperately maintaining the illusion that a military miracle could still be achieved through sheer force of will, long after any realistic prospect of relief had vanished. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the OKW, was intellectually and professionally sharper and more politically detached than Keitel. Jodl was among the very few top figures to quietly and professionally accept the absolute military inevitability of defeat in the final week. His statements and critical actions in the concluding hours focused not on fighting, but on managing the logistical and command collapse and attempting to establish credible communication lines with the newly appointed Donitz government. By April 30th, Jodl's primary professional focus had entirely shifted from organizing a defense to arranging the intricate logistics of a total ceasefire and ensuring that military discipline didn't completely dissolve into chaos before the formal, binding surrender could be executed. Joseph Goebbels, designated chancellor in Hitler's political will, embodied the absolute pinnacle of Nazi political fanaticism and ideological commitment. His final documented statements and actions showed no fear of death or attempt at escape, only a determined, almost theatrical commitment to political martyrdom alongside his Führer. He dedicated his final hours to dictating venomous political statements, praising Hitler as a martyr, and fiercely condemning the traitors who had allegedly caused the collapse, while ordering the fanatical continuation of the defense of the Reich Chancellery until the very last shot. On May 1st, after Hitler's death, Goebbels and his wife committed suicide, viewing the final collapse of Berlin not as a military loss, but as a necessary, heroic final act for the Nazi ideology. The completely irrational hope placed in General Walter Wenck's 12th Army became the enduring symbol of the German High Command's final, desperate delusion in the bunker. Though Wenck's forces were severely depleted and facing overwhelming Soviet pressure, Hitler and Keitel spent their last days obsessed with the idea of Wenck's imaginary relief attack on Berlin. Wenck's final, brutally honest communication stated clearly that his forces were utterly exhausted, numerically inferior, and physically incapable of reaching the besieged city. His actual objective was a practical, life-saving maneuver to create a westward corridor to save as many German soldiers and refugees as possible from the east, a pragmatic move that directly and courageously contravened Hitler's suicidal orders. General Helmuth Weidling, the last appointed commander of the Berlin defense area, issued the necessary, inevitable, and ultimately merciful order for the surrender of the city. Weidling's reaction was characterized by professional military pragmatism and a clear sense of responsibility for his troops and the remaining civilians. After confirming Hitler's suicide, he determined that any further fighting was a pointless slaughter. On May 2nd, he personally ordered his remaining forces to cease all resistance and signed the formal surrender document with the Soviets. His final statements conveyed the grim reality to his exhausted troops. The battle for Berlin has ceased. Your loyalty to the Führer now binds you to cease fighting. The Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, officially the command structure for the main army, had been systematically marginalized and functionally undermined by Hitler since 1941, who preferred to issue all critical direct orders via the OKW. As Berlin finally fell, the OKH effectively and completely dissolved. Remaining staff officers, operating out of temporary headquarters, attempted to maintain absolute radio silence or communicated only the bare essential surrender details. Their primary, harrowing concern, evident in fragmented command logs, was the desperate and imminent fate of the massive German army groups still fighting remotely in the east, realizing that the political collapse meant immediate, total annihilation for these remote forces. Donitz, operating strategically outside the besieged capital, immediately ordered General Jodl to commence preliminary negotiations for a general, comprehensive surrender on the Western Front, while simultaneously maintaining a limited, fierce resistance in the east. His public statement on this gambit was clear and devoid of Nazi rhetoric. The military collapse is certain. We must prevent the destruction of the German people. This strategic maneuver was a direct, explicit admission that the concept of total war had failed utterly, and that the single remaining overriding goal was humanitarian and nationalistic, to save as many German lives as possible from the advancing and feared Soviet armies. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, though disgracefully expelled from the party by Hitler, still clung desperately to a profound delusion of retaining a position of power. He made a final, desperate, and bizarre attempt to negotiate a ceasefire, reaching out to the Western Allies via the Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte. Himmler offered a surrender only to the West, while promising to continue the fight against the Soviets. Himmler's final communication betrayed a profound, dangerous self-importance. He offered himself as the new, acceptable leader of a post-Hitler Germany. The Allies, strictly following the Casablanca Declaration, demanding unconditional surrender, summarily rejected his delusional offer, making it unequivocally clear there would be no separate, negotiated peace. General Theodor Busse, commanding the German Ninth Army southeast of Berlin, part of the heavily battered remnants of Army Group Vistula, executed one of the most strategically crucial and successful troop breakouts of the final days. His final independent decision, made days before Berlin's fall, was entirely focused on the survival of his troops, to fight due west, not towards the doomed capital, but towards the Americans to surrender. Busse's reaction reflected a growing survival mentality within the general staff, a courageous willingness to disregard Hitler's suicidal orders in favor of saving lives and avoiding Soviet capture. His successful breakout and mass surrender to the Americans epitomized this final, practical, and widespread shift in command philosophy. Hans Fritzsche, the leading radio propagandist and head of the wireless division under Goebbels, was one of the last high-ranking civilian figures captured alive in the ruins of Berlin. His final broadcast statements were characterized by a sharp, observable decline in ideological fanaticism, moving toward a grim, necessary acknowledgement of the reality of military defeat. After Hitler's death was confirmed, his final message essentially announced the complete end of the Führer's regime. Fritzsche's capture and later appearance at the Nuremberg trials offered the court a crucial, if self-serving, first-hand account of the despair, delusion, and final hours of the Nazi leadership in the bunker. By the morning of May 1st, the main Reich Chancellery radio bunker, the absolute center of the Führerprinzip command structure, had definitively ceased transmitting all communications. The resulting radio silence was the most definitive military statement that the central authority and command structure of the Third Reich had completely and utterly collapsed. The only communication remaining was the intermittent, heavily coded traffic between Donitz's newly established northern headquarters, Flensburg, and the scattered army groups in the field, signaling the transfer of ultimate authority and the irreversible end of centralized military control from Berlin. Albert Speer, the powerful Minister of Armaments and War Production, had spent the last months actively and often secretly attempting to sabotage Hitler's devastating Nero decree, the scorched earth policy. Speer's final statements and communications, mostly directed towards the newly formed Donitz government, centered on the total, irreversible technical and industrial collapse of the Reich's ability to wage war. His reaction was that of a professional technician, a clinical assessment that the means to wage war had utterly vanished, making the surrender a matter of resource and logistical depletion, not just military defeat on the battlefield. Hitler's final, desperate, and politically motivated order, transmitted to the decimated forces surrounding Berlin, was the rhetorical demand to fight to the death and show unyielding loyalty to the ideal of the Reich. This order was, almost universally, ignored by every pragmatic field commander still capable of command. The consensus among responsible generals, including Weidling, was that obedience to this final political command constituted criminal insanity and would only lead to pointless massacres of troops and civilians. Their final collective refusal to execute this order was the final military rebellion against the Führer's suicidal political will. The remnants of the German General Staff, those highly trained professional officers who had survived the July 20th plot and the subsequent purges, expressed a quiet, palpable professional shame regarding the final collapse. Their final documented communications focused overwhelmingly on technical, administrative issues, accurate casualty reporting, the verifiable status of major units, and the maintenance of internal discipline among the surrendering forces. Their statements deliberately and rigorously avoided political rhetoric, reflecting a desperate desire to distance themselves from the catastrophic political crimes of the regime and fulfill their final, necessary professional duty of managing the military's surrender and post-war organization. Hitler's dramatic naming of Donitz as Reich's president was a highly symbolic, last-minute move designed to shift authority decisively from the charismatic, totalitarian Führerprinzip, leader principle, back to a traditional, legal-sounding, bureaucratic state structure. Donitz's first public statements were cautious and legalistic, explicitly invoking the continuity of the state and military chain of command. He attempted to legitimize his new government not through the failed ideology of Nazism, but through a perceived continuation of traditional conservative German state authority and administrative function, preparing the groundwork for the inevitable surrender. The most critical defining decision of the newly formed Donitz government was the explicit order to commit to a rapid, unconditional surrender on the Western Front, while maintaining hostilities in the East. This was not a military necessity for the powerful Western Allies, but a political, humanitarian, and strategic imperative for the Germans. The German High Command's primary concern, explicitly stated by Donitz, was the severe Soviet brutality and retribution anticipated in the East. Donitz ordered that every hour gained on the Western Front allowed hundreds of thousands of refugees and soldiers to flow westward and escape certain Soviet captivity. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, under the direct, unyielding command of Marshal Joseph Stalin, viewed any German attempt at a partial surrender, East versus West, with total and explicit contempt. Their official communications insisted on nothing less than total and unconditional surrender to all Allied powers simultaneously and without delay. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's final orders to the forces surrounding Berlin were clear and aggressive: accept only unconditional surrender and immediately detain any German officer attempting to negotiate a limited or separate ceasefire with the Soviets. Despite Joseph Goebbels' suicide, a final, somber, and carefully worded broadcast was made over German radio on the night of May 1st. The broadcast announced solemnly that the Führer has fallen at his command post in the Reich Chancellery, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism and for the German nation. The remaining High Command allowed this broadcast as a necessary political formality to transition power to Donitz, while simultaneously attempting to spin the total military defeat as a heroic ideological sacrifice rather than a humiliating, complete military and political collapse. The very last communications to leave the Führer bunker were not concerned with military strategy, but with internal political actions and purges. These communications documented the confirmation of the expulsion of Himmler and Göring and the frantic last-minute attempts to secure transport for select loyalists who were to flee the city. The documented final statements confirmed the atmosphere of profound fear, hysteria, and betrayal that consumed the inner circle, confirming that the High Command's final political statement was one of internal purges and total self-destruction. General Jodl, having successfully navigated the collapse and travelled to Donitz's Flensburg headquarters, played the absolutely key role in the final, comprehensive surrender negotiations. His statement upon signing the first unconditional surrender document in Reims was one of muted, exhausted despair, acknowledging the catastrophic magnitude of the defeat without any political embellishment. Jodl was the consummate professional soldier, forced to admit ultimate, total failure, stating that the signing was necessary to prevent further chaos, marking the formal end of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, as a functional, unified entity. The field commanders of the massive German army groups still actively fighting in the east, Vistula and Centre, reacted to the fall of Berlin with uncoordinated confusion and mounting desperation. Their final radio messages, logged by both Allied and Soviet interceptors, showed a chaotic mix of panic, resource exhaustion, and desperation. Their final statements often focused on securing imaginary supply lines that had ceased to exist and attempting, futilely, to lead their remaining forces west toward the American lines. The final tragedy for these commanders was the complete fragmentation of command and the failure of Berlin to provide any coherent exit strategy. The Western Allies, specifically General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Supreme Command, made it absolutely clear to Donitz's negotiating team that the strategy of selective partial surrender was entirely unacceptable and non-negotiable. Their final statement on the matter was uncompromising. The surrender must be simultaneous, comprehensive, and unconditional on all fronts, east and west, to all Allied powers. This firm demand effectively ended Donitz's strategic gambit and led directly to the final signing of the instruments of total, unconditional surrender on May 7th, Reims, and its ratification on May 8th, Berlin. The final statements and desperate actions of the German High Command revealed a profound, irreconcilable dichotomy in the final hours of the war. Figures like Keitel and Goebbels clung to ideological delusion and political fanaticism until their death. In stark contrast, figures like Donitz, Jodl, and Weidling ultimately chose to act on purely pragmatic, professional, and humanitarian grounds to execute the surrender and save lives. The fall of Berlin forced the surviving High Command to finally choose between political loyalty to a dead regime and military responsibility to the German people, a defining choice that marks the final, tragic chapter of the Third Reich.